Thank you. Shamoon actually has had to step away for some time, so I'm actually taking over the floor. But thank you, David. It's impressive to hear the New Zealand example, and you have given us a lot of food for thought there about how to continue with parliamentary oversight even in these difficult times. And I think turning to another small island nation now, we'd like to hear a little bit from our colleague Ayesha, who's coming from the Attorney General's office in the Maldives, and she's going to be speaking to a slightly different perspective. She's going to be talking on the legislative drafting perspective. Ayesha, I'd like to hand the floor over to you, please.
Thank you. Before I start on my topic, I'd just like to give you a brief background on the state of emergency that we declared here because due to the pandemic. We actually had 3 different legal mechanisms that we could have utilized in response to the epidemic. There was the constitutional authority given to the president to declare a state of emergency. There was also the National Disaster Management Act, which also authorizes a declaration of a state of disaster. But we resorted to the Public Health Protection Act, which allowed the Minister of Health to declare a state of public health emergency. We declared a public health emergency on 12th of March. By then, our local council elections were scheduled to be held in April of this year, mid-April. So the first order of business that we were required to attend to was to postpone the elections when it became apparent that the epidemic was causing, we couldn't move forward with the election as planned. So we had to draft an amendment to, or rather introduce new legislation to postpone the election. But it wasn't a simple matter of drafting primary legislation, because our constitution had a limitation that we had to first attend to before we could pass the legislation to postpone the elections. We actually had to draft 4 pieces of emergency legislation. One, as I mentioned, was to postpone the local council elections. And the second was an amendment to the constitution. Third was to amend the Criminal Procedure Code. And finally, we had to prepare a special bill on COVID-19 emergency procedures. The first 2 bills we worked on together. Just to give you a brief background, our local councils had a fixed term of 3 years, which was stipulated in our constitution. So we needed to, the term was set to expire on 3rd June. So even if we postponed the elections, we could not do so beyond 3rd June. So we had to first amend the constitution, which we eventually did, but there was a lot of debate as to whether a constitutional amendment was required. After much debate and a very rushed procedure, in which even our Supreme Court was involved, we finally managed to amend the Constitution. Our Constitution authorizes the Parliament to seek an advisory opinion of the Supreme Court in matters of national importance. So they decided to seek their opinion on whether the Constitution had to be amended. All of this took a matter of just days, and the Constitution was amended, I think, from the time the bill was submitted to when the actual amendment was passed, it was just within a week. So you can imagine how the parliamentary process would have been rushed. Once the Constitution amendment was in effect, we also drafted, we submitted both bills together, although the Parliament decided to pass the local council elections bill first, although it didn't come into effect until the Constitution amendment was in place. So for the Local Council Elections Act, we had to postpone the election. We did include a provision that required that the new election be held within 12 months. And we also preserved the candidacies that were already announced so that we would not have to restart the whole process again. Both of these amendments, legislation came into effect at around the same time. The third bill that we had to draft was an amendment to the Criminal Procedure Code to allow for certain time limits provided in the law to be extended. There were certain limitations or time limits prescribed for filing a prosecution, appeals, and the like. So a lot of cases were pending when the epidemic hit. So we had to enable the prosecution and also the investigation teams at the police to give them more time to meet the deadlines that were required by law. So we introduced some new measures to enable the Prosecutor General and also the courts to bring in new rules to sort of manage the issues that had come up because of the pandemic. It wasn't, unlike the previous two legislation, this wasn't a law in the sense that we introduced a more permanent feature which was to be utilized in the event of emergency. So there's no temporary measure or a sunset clause in this particular bill. We then had to draft a COVID-19 special measures bill, which included provisions relating to forced evictions, providing food and temporary shelter to those who were rendered homeless, temporary drug treatment programs, especially leave relating to COVID-related absences. We had to allow for court proceedings to be held via video conferencing, and certain procedural flexibilities to allow the government and state institutions to function while maintaining social distancing and other guidelines imposed by the public health authorities. While the other three laws were pretty straightforward, as I mentioned, the COVID-19 special measures bill had a lot of varying topics that we had to address. Our main challenges were in identifying or narrowing down the policies that were initially identified. We received very broad policy directions, which were eventually narrowed down, but it took us some time to go back and forth in consultation with the respective government ministries to finally narrow them down. We had roughly a month to draft the bill, and most of that time was spent on identifying or refining the policies. We also had to use legislative drafting tools which we would not have always used in a bill that we would have been drafting had we had more time. We had to rely on broadly drafted provisions to cater for situations that may arise in the future that we may not. We also had to use some blind amendments which really would not have directed the public to which particular laws that we were amending through the new measures that we were introducing in the bill. But we did limit those very broad provisions to sort of, the application was limited to state actors rather than the public, so that it wouldn't have created an extra burden on the public to try and figure out what we were actually trying to address there. We also introduced certain safeguards in that any measures or orders that were imposed by the new law had to be published in the Gazette within a certain number of days, which, if I recall, were 14 days. We did not, given the measures that we introduced in the law, we did not feel that an independent review mechanism was necessary, but we did add certain safeguards in that the law itself was set to expire with the when the public health emergency ceased to have effect. So these measures are intended to be very temporary, and most of our challenges included, as I mentioned, in formulating and narrowing down policies. We had to draft a lot more provisions than were eventually included in the bill. So some of those policies were, or provisions were discarded to those provisions that were absolutely necessary. That bill is still pending before Parliament, while the other 3 bills have now been enacted into law. Unless you have other questions, I think I can wrap up.
That's great. Thank you, Ayesha, for that very informative presentation and for outlining the 4 pieces of legislation that you've been working on. It sounds like you've been very busy during this period, as everyone has. And I think these 3 presentations or interventions have really outlined how states have had to adapt, and hearing the comparative experiences, the experience of New Zealand, but also that of the Maldives, just demonstrates how everyone has had to adapt quickly and timely, and that some things have worked and that some things haven't. So I'd like to pose a question to each of our panelists, and then I'd like to open the floor for interventions and questions with them. So I'd like to start that. So Bryn, you outlined a lot of different models and different ways in which states have responded to the COVID crisis, and the ways that parliaments can continue to have oversight during this difficult period. And what are some of the most innovative responses that you've seen, and perhaps some of the best practices? I'd love to hear more on that. And David, if I may already turn to you as well. So in some states in election years, such as the USA and Poland, they've had weak responses to COVID. And why do you think New Zealand was different? How do you think this was facilitated, for example, by technology? And what was the impact on the decision to change parliamentary procedures? And lastly, Ayesha, the question I would pose to you now was about amending the Constitution. This is considered risky, especially during times of crisis. And it's even disallowed in some constitutions, such as in Greece. So how did your concerns play into that? Into the procedures following drafting the amendment? And obviously the gravity of the amendment is great. So I'd like to hear more from each of you, and then we'll open the floor for comments and questions. Please, Bryn, I'll hand the floor to you first.
Sure. So I guess to start off with, I think it's important just to say that there is no one size fits all when it comes to figuring out how to deal with this. Every country has different parliamentary procedures, different constitutional makeups, and has had to deal with different circumstances with regard to COVID. So I think that that's the first thing to say. In terms of best practices, though, there are a couple of interesting approaches that have been taken. So I think that firstly, we can say that technology has played a really big role in how people have reacted to the pandemic. And a lot of parliaments around the world have held sittings on Zoom or using those kinds of platforms. Of course, there are difficulties with that. I say that recognizing that we are using Zoom and that we use Zoom for a lot of our meetings for the foundation as well. There are, of course, difficulties around it. So sure, you can perhaps record a meeting and publish it later, but in terms of transparency, how transparent is that, for instance? So some of the most innovative approaches around the use of technology have come from smaller states. So for instance, I stand to be corrected, El Salvador, for instance, has its own YouTube channel. And as opposed to, or the El Salvadori parliament, so instead of using Zoom and publishing videos later, they record their meetings and people can watch them live. I know that there are also certain countries where there's, for instance, a parliamentary channel where you can always watch Parliament when it's sitting in its ordinary state. And so developing that as well to allow for technology to be integrated and virtual meetings to be shown on those kind of channels, I think is an important best practice in terms of transparency. I would also just say that there are, of course, three approaches or three kind of main roles that we classically give to Parliament, right? There's the legislative role, and perhaps that may have been decreased somewhat. But then there's still the participatory role, the need to participate with constituents and with the public, and of course the oversight role. So I think that the example that David gave of the New Zealand approach is really innovative in that it was led by the opposition. And so that distinguishes it from a number of countries that have set up these kind of committees that look at oversight in particular. And so in terms of best practices, the short answer is just that approaches that integrate transparency and that integrate public participation to ensure that even where Parliament, for instance, is not passing that much legislation, they're still interacting with constituents and interacting with them in carrying out their oversight commitments. Those would be best practices in my view.
Thank you. That's very interesting. And I think we'll all be tuning in to YouTube to watch the El Salvadorian Parliament. I'd now hand the floor over to David to answer my question. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Imogen. I think in terms of why the response to COVID-19 was quite strong here, there were a variety of factors. I think a key political one is that our politics are not that polarized. It's a small country, as you know, a liberal country, had a long history of continuous democracy, and the political parties are really competing for the middle ground where most of the voters are. There are just not that, as a society, there don't seem to be that many people with extreme views, and so it's difficult, I think, to have wildly different opinions about things and to get popular support for that with something like a public health crisis. The other thing I'd add, which I'm a bit uncomfortable about as a non-partisan parliamentary official, is that the Prime Minister was particularly effective in handling it. She's extremely popular. She's a very clear communicator, and she coined this phrase, a team of 5 million, which is the population, and really kind of galvanized everyone to think they were working towards the same goal. And so that included the opposition. I mean, obviously, they don't agree with all of the policies of the government, and they want to be the government, but I think there was a strong degree of recognition that this isn't the time to do those things, and to certainly scrutinise the government, to criticise it where appropriate, but not to oppose it just for the sake of opposition. And so there was that high level of cooperation. I talked about that being through the business committee. I think the other thing is we've got a habit in New Zealand, probably for about the last 40 years, of reviewing our parliamentary procedure every 3 years before the election and making changes. We've just finished that process now. It's always done just before the election, before we know who the government will be next. And so those changes can never be to the advantage of the government of the day because they don't know who it's going to be. Because there's that history of of experimentation and innovation, members are quite willing to try out new things with short notice where there's a good reason to do it, and you know, the pandemic was a good reason. So I think those things combined to make it a pretty effective response.
Thank you. I know that's really interesting to hear how the political landscape has changed and perhaps in some ways strengthened democracy from what you're saying, which is very interesting. So I'll hand over to Ayesha before opening the floor for interventions.
Thank you, Martin. The decision to amend the Constitution was not an easy one. We had actually amended the Constitution the previous year to extend the term of the councils from 3 to 5 years, but the amendment had not come into effect and was delayed until the new members were elected. But we had to postpone the election to at least around 12 months or so. So we had to sort of figure out a way to move past the constitutional requirement. And the government, in fact, submitted a bill to sort of remove this lock that prevented the amendment from coming into effect. But there was much debate in Parliament, and some of the members felt that a constitutional amendment was not required. In fact, another bill was proposed to counter our version of it. And then the Parliament decided to seek the opinion of the Supreme Court on the matter. And they ultimately decided that, or rather advised that a constitutional amendment was required, and not a temporary one as we had proposed, but rather that we had to include a provision in the Constitution itself to say that we could temporarily extend the term of the current councils until the new members were elected. So it was quite odd to have such a provision in the Constitution, but that was a decision that was reached after the advice from the Supreme Court. And eventually we now have a temporary provision in our Constitution, which is part of the text of the Constitution.
Thank you. It sounds like it wasn't an easy decision to take at all. So now I'd like to invite interventions from the floor. If I may, Madam Shaista, Pervaiz, I don't know if you make any intervention at this point.
Thank you very much. It has been a great learning experience for me, at least as a legislator. What I feel and what I see is that we need to be learning from other countries which are doing great. We have been, actually, our weaknesses have been exposed a lot during this COVID-19 period. But as I'm just listening, we have a lot to do. We need to be doing a lot. But at the moment, it was the opposition which requested for a setting of whichever wave of the parliament, so that we could legislate and we could see how things can be worked forward. But as you must be aware, at the moment, our parliament is in a very, I should say, it's a polarized sort of a thing. But on this issue, I feel we need to sit, because if we don't legislate, we will be handing over unlimited powers to the executive, and we will be diminishing the role of the representatives of the country. So I am just listening and trying to take notes and to see how we can move forward and adapt these rules according to our constitution and according to our provisions which are given in the parliament. So I will be listening, and later on I'll be having my questions ready for you.
Thank you, Madam. No, it's interesting to reflect as well. As I said, at this point, if there is a second wave, there is another opportunity for us to adapt again and see how we respond. Thank you. Please, Madam Shandana, if you'd like to take the floor.
Hi, Imogen. Thank you so much. My apologies. I think I was supposed to make the closing remarks. However, I have another event, and I think it's such an interesting discussion, but we've taken a little bit of more chunk of time than I had calculated earlier. So if that's all right, I'll sort of amend my closing comments to sort of fit the narrative of what's being discussed now in a couple of major points. First of all, thank you everyone for having us here. Thank you for hosting us. It's always useful to listen to other countries' experiences. I wear another hat, not just as a legislator for Pakistan. I'm also the chair of the Commonwealth Women Parliamentarians. In fact, we have access to a huge amount of information and data on what other countries are doing. Luckily, the CPA, like the ITU, is doing a lot for women parliamentarians to ensure that we have the real outreach that we need to be having in COVID. And this is an exercise nobody was prepared for. Pandemics usually people are prepared for. And so perhaps listening to some of the more interesting things from Ms. Guthrie, from you, Imogen, as well as from Ayesha and the Senior Clerk of New Zealand, one thing I can say that there has been two particular spate of, let's say, law making / policy making. Neither of them were directly related to COVID, but when the opportunity presented itself, we realized that this is the way we need to go. The first one, working backwards, and we may have a joint session of the Parliament tomorrow, day after, is rather controversial, but it just highlights what happens in such pandemics or in such states of emergency. And that is that we have, for Pakistan, we're on a particular task force, the Financial Action Task Force, and this is essentially for anti-terrorism bills and for bills against money laundering. As you know, Pakistan has been a victim. It's funny how we've been portrayed as a country that supports terrorism, never realizing that we're a country that suffered from it the most for the nearly 15 years. So as members who are on the FATF watch list, we are trying to come out of the grey list, and we have had to amend a number of legislations, a lot of which happened to come during this COVID time. And because global economies, I wouldn't say are failing, but are crunching, the latest numbers anywhere between $9 and $11 trillion. And that's a scary number. And thank God we haven't yet reached the proportions even of 1998 to 99, and as well as 2004, which that was just 1 to 3% of global economies. But right now, we're looking at least 1% of a crunch of the global economy. So in comes emergency legislation, highly controversial. We have not been able to gain much traction with the opposition. But I think that also looks at the positive side of democracy, that we have a guardian, we have the opposition that is opposing certain legislations which are vital for Pakistan's well-being. At the same time, they sometimes make amendments, which we accept. Sometimes they make amendments we don't accept, but at least it talks about an awake legislature. And you'll see a lot of noise on the floor, but that is the essence of a democracy. So that is the legislative part. It's been difficult, quite unlike the New Zealand experience, where we heard about the collaborative nature of things. But in Pakistan, it's just the opposite for the moment. However, that also serves a purpose, and an important purpose. We're a nation of 220 million people. Somebody has to keep an eye on us. And as was stated earlier, emergency legislation is just that. Regardless of the state of emergency or legal status of the emergency, you still have to keep your eyes open, and it's important to have an active opposition. Secondly, now this is coming to the good part. You might be aware that Pakistan has had for many, many years a social service program called BISP, which was the Benazir Bhutto Income Support Program. And from that, nearly 4 million women were being served. However, during the pandemic, 10 days after the pandemic, and we had a lockdown, you could see the impact of the lockdown all across the countryside. 66% of Pakistan's population lives in the rural areas, which means they're involved in agriculture, which means these are not necessarily educated people, and they're working in the construction sector, which means 66% of your population is without a job. Now that is a situation ripe for a revolution, for a social revolution, for an economic revolution. Just look at Lebanon and look at Minsk, what was happening yesterday in the middle of the COVID. Look at the United States. So we've been lucky. We've managed to avoid that big impasse, as big as the Grand Canyon, as it were. What we did was the following. We took policy measures and 4 big things, and I'll explain those later. 1, we launched an emergency cash transfer, different from the social cash transfer, for 12 million households, not women, 12 million households. It's been built with longer term goals, which we've never been able to do in Pakistan for financial inclusivity for women, to bring them into the banking network. Women traditionally in the rural areas are not allowed to go alone to banks, either with their husbands, they could go with their sons, less even to shops, household, to go to different markets. So this was a huge thing. Thirdly, we're taking the payment system from cash-based to digital. And fourthly, beneficiaries are being encouraged to spread this in the community. Now, what was the practical result? Some of you who are familiar with banking practices may know that there's a number of measures, bank stake, where you try to open an account. To look at your ID, the know your customer checks, they do your background checks. And what we've done is now, we've done all these background checks because families were under this impression that this is another cash transfer. They didn't realize with embedding financial inclusivity into the system, of course they got cash transfers. That was a lump sum. They got nearly 75 USD. But what has happened is that these women are now, and men and women both, they have a limited mandate account with which they can open up a bank account anytime they wish. They actually have these CNIC points, which were important in Brazil. What you did was you took even your mercantile agents, you took them towards the banking system. These people don't traditionally pay taxes. And so what you've done is, in a not so obvious way, is you've brought 12 million individuals and families and enterprises into a financial inclusivity system, which normally doesn't cater for the poor, the disenfranchised, the women, and the minorities. So this was our biggest. Now, we didn't do this through legislation because we realized the minute we take to the House, of course, there were going to be incredible positive amendments to it as well. There was going to be some politicization as well. But the question was time. Do you allow 66% of your population to go starving? And I have witnessed it firsthand. I come from a village. I had to go to my area. We women reserve. I'm a, as you say, a reserve parliamentarian or a representative parliamentarian. And so we don't have constituencies. We have areas which are often bigger than constituencies. And I've been to nearly 800 to 1,000 households. And the misery that I saw was only mitigated by this Ehsas emergency cash transfer of the Prime Minister, which earlier Riaz Fatyana also mentioned. So I wanted to bring these 2 things to your attention, to the discussion, that unfortunately, as an ardent lover of democracy, I realized that we had difficult choices. Either we were going to bulldoze this policy, not legislation, and we were going to get the people, 66% of this country, to eat. Or we could go through Parliament, we could take the necessary precautions and have the best possible law. But I guess the answer I have found is that what stops us now from making this legal? What stops us now from bringing in the requisite legislation to ensure that in the future there is transparency, there's monitoring, and there's tracking? And the best part of it, this was done apolitically. There are people from my own political party which oppose this program because it was distributing money without any political affiliation. So imagine you've brought an apolitical banking and financial inclusivity process, both for women who would never have access to a bank, let alone a computer, to disenfranchised men, as well as you've brought merchants into that. So I will stop here. I'm sorry I'm not going to be able to stay any more than this, but I do hope, since it's being recorded, I'm able to get a copy of this so I can see what happened after I left. Thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you, Madam Shandana, for that very interesting intervention. I think it's really important to bring up the gender dimension as well for female parliamentarians, but also more broadly the gender impact of the crisis. We've spoken about many challenges, and you also raised many additional ones as well. Thank you for that. I do notice as well that Madam Ayesha Raza has raised her hand, and I wondered if you'd like to respond to anything that has been said so far. Please, you have the floor.
Yes. Thank you, Imogen, and thank you to NDF and all our partners who've convened today's session. It is very useful. I've really enjoyed the presentations by all 3 panelists, and it's interesting to see how parliaments around the world have coped with the COVID challenge. It certainly was difficult, and everyone's done it in the best manner possible. As a member Senate and as a chairperson of the Committee on Rules of Procedure and Privileges, I just wanted to share with you what I think could have been done better. I mean, there's certainly lessons to be learned for each one of us here. And we certainly should make the requisite changes to enable us to be better prepared for such emergencies, health or otherwise, from the Parliament's point of view in the future. So I certainly agree with all that the role of the Parliament was important here, more so as a representative of the people, also to play the role of oversight here, which unfortunately in Pakistan, we saw the Parliament quite conspicuous by its absence, where we saw the judiciary, where we saw the executive going about doing their duty. Despite the pandemic COVID challenges, we saw both the National Assembly, the lower house and the upper house, and failing to convene for over a month in the time, I think, where the Parliament really needed to step up to play its due role. So as a chairperson of the Committee on Rules of Procedure and Privileges, I know that the Chairman Senate had referred to us the possibility of holding a virtual session. And because we have a codified constitution, it did not. I mean, and most very, very senior legislators and lawyers in my committee thought that the constitution did not allow a virtual sitting. And I think that is something the Parliament of Pakistan and us legislators need to look at, to use technology to ensure virtual settings when the need arises. Also, I think the Parliament needs to invest in technology which allows better connectivity, security, face recognition, which other parliaments of the world have apps that allow voting to take place and so forth. So that's one lesson I think we clearly as legislators have learned here. Two, I think where our panelists, honorable panelists have mentioned how the executives amassed powers. I think we saw that happening in extreme measures in Pakistan, where we had the National Action Plan for COVID drawn up as a policy document for preparedness, containment, and mitigation, risk mitigation for COVID. It never came to the Parliament for discussion or oversight. So in a country where you have a strong opposition, where we are politically polarized, I think the Parliament can play its due role in ensuring that there is a consensus building and we work together, and also ensure a better consensus and better coordination between the federal government and the provinces here, which was lacking quite a bit in Pakistan's Parliament's response to COVID. We saw most decisions being made in the National Coordination Committee, where although you had all chief executives of the provinces present, but we did not have meaningful debate or discussion take place. So clearly, where in the federal government, the National Disaster Management Act was invoked to impose the emergency health and basic fundamental rights, whether of association or travel, were put on hold, and it should have been correctly. I do think that health, and COVID being a health subject primarily, was not used, and legislation relating to health was not used to the extent that it should have been for properly dealing with the COVID crisis over here. I do think going forward, forums like the National Emergency Operations Center that the Pakistan government had set up for the polio outbreak was used very, very successfully to deal with COVID also, and it played an important role in collecting data, in surveillance activities, together with the National Command and Operations Center, where other stakeholders, which is your law enforcement agencies, sat together with the government. So where you saw a big role that the executive sort of took on, the role of the Parliament took a back seat here. And I think that we saw missing, and I hope we can learn from this lesson and ensure that, no matter how polarized, politically polarized a country is, it is important to make a consensus debate, because I think parliamentarians, legislators are representatives of the people, and you may have emergency legislation through ordinances, which was done here, whether it was banning exports of PPE, banning exports of vital medicines, etc., etc. You saw just the National Coordination Committee taking those decisions, and some people criticized that the correct forum under your constitution was the Council of Common Interest, which brings all stakeholders together from provinces. So yes, it's been an enlightening session, and I think we'd like it to continue to keep learning and put in institutional mechanisms to help countries cope with these crises. If this is going to be a new normal, which we see it being in the immediate future, I do think we need the role of the parliament strengthening more and more here. The Pakistan Senate, for example, did put in appropriate risk mitigation strategies to ensure that we sat spaced out. We did our COVID test before convening, but we did represent the people, and we were seen to be out there protecting their interests in times like COVID. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. And it's very wonderful to hear such a candid reflection on lessons learned in Pakistan, and important to reflect on how we can move forward with that in mind. So I'd like to invite Mr. Mohammed Rashid for the last intervention from the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Imogen. I think as the Honourable members have rightly pointed out, I would take the Honourable Senator Ayesha's suggestion that basically the institutional role has to be included, because in Pakistan, we have organizations like 1122, which is a kind of quick response mechanism. We have National Disaster Management Authority and its provincial chapters, but they need to be more proactive in such situations. However, I like to acknowledge that the Parliament of Pakistan, as soon as 1958, let me inform all participants, came up with the Epidemic Diseases Act 1958, which equips us to face such situations, and I think which provided a kickoff to the executive, because it has, I'll just highlight 5 points. It allows emergency and restrictions and lockdowns, how it had to be done. So I think we need to really acknowledge the first National Assembly of Pakistan, which was founded by the Qaeda-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah as first speaker, that they had developed this legislation as soon as 1958, which allows the executive to do the restrictions, isolation also, traveling restrictions also. It also includes testing in such epidemics and pandemics, and area sealing, penalties, and it also caters to some extent compensation which needs to be given to the general public. So Pakistan, once entering this, already had a very comprehensive legislation, which, yes, needs improvement, because we need, as the Senator Ayesha Raza Farooq very clearly mentioned, that the institutions that we have built afterwards need to be incorporated in this legislation. And I think that's the key requirement at this particular moment. That's why is a post-legislative scrutiny, which I think can need to be done by the standing committees of the Parliament very quickly. And however, I like to disagree, Imogen, with you that a second wave is going to come. We are united. The other thing, the second point is that yes, though we were in a very polarized state, but our parliamentary parties substantially went much beyond their partisan approach to formulate a tremendous national unity. And that's the second point, because the legislator has one role of legislation and oversight, but the second important role, representation. I know members of parliament across parties. In the first 2 weeks of lockdowns, they were not sitting at home. They were on the streets. They were making packets of food items, 12 necessary essential kitchen items, and they were distributed across parties. So that was a fascinating kickoff, because once we saw our MPAs, members of national assemblies and senators doing that on the streets, I tell you, for the daily wagers, then it was like a snowball effect. And I just like just to give you a joke that one of my friends had to needed a daily wager within the first 2 weeks. I'm telling you that he wanted to shift certain luggage from one place to another within his home. But you know, the daily wager there said, how much you're going to pay me? And of course, he said that that's 1 day charges are daily wages around 1,200 to 1,500 rupees. And you know what the daily wager said? He said, no, if I remain at a particular place in the city where all the daily wages are, especially the workers sit, we call them mazdoor in our local dialect. He says, I'm going to get more money and I'm going to get more food by my people. So, I mean, that was fascinating. it sent tears in my eyes that this is a fascinating nation that formulated unity. And in that, the roles of parliamentarians, it's unfortunate that our media only portrayed the worst part of it. But this very humane aspect of parliamentarians across parties, from the opposition and from the government also, they were doing that. The first 15 days, that were the most critical part. As I said, that Parliament already had this act, the good thing was. And the first notification which went that an emergency has to be put on, certain streets had to be locked down, it was accordingly done in the federal capital and in 3 provinces according to this Epidemic Act 1958. Sindh, however, one of the provinces, had developed in 2015 an updated version of it. And let me tell you, the Provincial Assembly of Sindh also took changes in its rule, and they were the first now who are holding virtual sessions. So, I mean, there are really good practices also. I'm an optimistic person, so emphasizing the good things that our honorable parliamentarians and the parliament has done. And last point, and on which I'm going to finish, that the session was requested by the opposition, and there was ultimately we have a bicameral system. So it's obviously difficult with 13 to 19 parliamentary parties to engage them. And yes, our Senate Hall has, because there are 104 members, it was easier for spread around. But our National Assembly is 342 members, though we have a big hall, but it's not only the members, the reporters, and it is a whole 3,000 people they gather once the parliament is around. But many people risks, and with the masks, they came to the parliament. And in the first 24 hours, I recall, I got 3 calls. One from an opposition MNA that PIPS should tell us that what should we do? How should we meet? Should it be a virtual thing? Should we all come to the parliament? Then we were also in touch with the business committee of the National Assembly of Pakistan, and the Honorable Chairman Senate also asked us what to do. So let me assure you, within 12 hours, we were able to give 3 suggestions to the honorable members that a virtual session or a hybrid session is also possible. And let me tell you that this all came at a juncture where we were daggers drawn, we were polarized, as Honorable Madam Shaista shared with us, objectively. But yet, within the next 2 weeks, we were into substantial national unity, and which was much beyond partisan things. So ultimately, the Provincial Assembly of Sindh, they came with change of rules, and they are having the virtual things. On the National Assembly, what they came up with an innovation that, for example, rather than 342 members, they shortened, let's say 100 odd members would come, 50% from the opposition and from the government to talk on the matter out. So, I mean, my hope, on which I like to close, is that there will not be any second wave, because this national unity, besides everything, continues. And the member of parliament we look up to as our leaders, because being public elected representatives, they are the real voice of the people. And in Pakistan, we have, I know, at least 70, 80 them very sensitive, humane people which are leading the way in their all political parties. One last thing, I like to share with my sister from Maldives, a historic fact that I want to share, that Pakistan built the Maldivian parliament building, as a matter of fact. So I just wanted to highlight that this brotherhood that parliamentarians bring across countries is very significant. And that's why we are here learning from each other. I thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for that very enriching intervention. I do hope that you're right about a second wave. And it's great to see the spirit of democracy that's coming out of what is a very challenging situation. So I'd now like to turn back to our panelists, and I'm conscious that we've run over time already. So if we could ask them to respond to any of the points that have been addressed and any questions that have been raised, and as any advice or really key messages that they'd like to share with everyone today at the webinar. So I'd like to hand the floor first to David, and then Bryn and Ayesha for the final word. Thank you.
All right. Thanks very much, Imogen. And And I think during my presentation, I gave some advice, which I hope was useful. And I'm very conscious that, you know, every country is in its own situation in terms of dealing with COVID-19. What works in one place might not in another. There are two things I wanted to reflect on. One is the future. As I've said, we're quite fortunate in New Zealand to be in Ireland and to be isolated, but we are an economy heavily dependent on overseas trade and tourism. Our main export is milk powder, which we primarily sell to China, and that's continued. But our second biggest income earner is tourism. And with our borders closed to everyone who's not a citizen at present, you know, there's a significant economic hole that will have to change at some point. And I think there's a, you know, a significant risk to the country of losing the control that we've currently got over the disease. But that is something that will have to happen. And so I think a focus for the government and for the Parliament is putting in place the most robust mechanisms possible to address that, while accepting there will have to be some risk. And that's a difficult thing, I think, for citizens to accept. But, you know, it's really the reality of the situation. The other thing I thought I'd just mention is, I suppose one of the positive things about the response to the pandemic was that it allowed our Parliament to try out a lot of new procedures that it may have got to trying out over a few years a bit more cautiously, but because they were needed urgently, a lot of changes were put in place. They were experimented with. They were mostly found to be really successful, particularly increases in holding ministers to account in committees and in the main plenary as well. And so I mentioned we'd done a review of our standing orders. A lot of the changes that were made temporarily became permanent changes during that review. And so I guess one of the positives was we tried a lot of those things out. They were found to work, and not just to be good in the pandemic response, but actually useful longer term. So committees are going to continue meeting online if they wish to. There's going to be enhanced questioning of ministers. Some of those other changes that were made quite quickly will stay in place as well. So, I mean, I'm cautious about, you know, saying there are positive things to come out of a terrible global illness, but there were some things that I think, you know, have been positive, and I want to keep that in sight as well. That's all from me.
Thank you. No, it's great to hear that this is not all doom and gloom, which often is the case when we talk about COVID, and to hear that the positives and the opportunities that are also coming out of this. Bryn, would you like to take the floor?
So I think two main things from my side. The first is around so thinking about a second wave, whether it will come or not. I think if we reflect on what's happening in Europe at the moment, it reflects that trade-off that David was speaking about, where at some point we'll have to open borders and we'll have to allow people to travel. We'll have to allow goods and services to travel and all of that kind of thing. And we've seen in Europe people coming back from holidays, people coming back from various other European countries, has led to a spike in cases, not to the level that it was at the height of the previous wave, but certainly in a growing number that raises concerns, perhaps not for a second wave that was as extreme as before, but certainly that COVID is something that is going to be around in the future, at least until we have a vaccine, and at least until we've kind of figured out how we're going to deal with it in the long term. And so I think that raises interesting reflections in terms of parliamentary procedures, because as was mentioned in one of the interventions, it is possible to take policies, for instance, that were, or regulations that were promulgated during times of emergency, and transform them into legislation, and transform them into legislation with necessary parliamentary oversight, checks and balances. And I think that raises an opportunity for parliamentarians, because if COVID is something that is going to be around in the long term, we don't want the executive in control of all of those responses in perpetuity. And so it's important that Parliament takes over reviewing the implementation of government strategies so that they can determine what can be transformed into legislation in the long term. And I think that some of the ways of reviewing the efficacy of those government policies may include the constituent work that was spoken about in one of the interventions, you know, speaking to people on the ground, understanding exactly how things played out, but also, of course, the amendment of procedures and the allowing for debates and those kinds of things. So I think that even if it's not a second wave, it's certainly an acknowledgement that until that we're unlikely to return to a state of normalcy anytime soon. But for parliaments to be able to be effective, it's important that they figure out how to ensure that checks and balances at least return to normal levels. The other thing that I would just like to comment on is around technology. And of course, that's been a critical problem around the world, particularly in states that do have income inequality and difficulties in ensuring that everybody has access to the same kinds of technology. I think that this offers an opportunity to underscore the importance or the critical nature of that kind of infrastructure, and perhaps not to necessarily argue that it is a fundamental right, as one of the speakers mentioned, but certainly to argue that it is a supporter that enables individuals to exercise their fundamental rights. And perhaps for parliamentarians looking at the way that they can address government responses and transform that into legislation, that might be something to consider as well when also trying to enhance the equitable application of those responses. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bryn, for that intervention. And I think you're right, there's a lot of innovation that we need in order to respond, but it's also interesting to reflect on how the role of Parliament is perhaps strengthened as well. And again, we're seeing a lot of opportunities here. Ayesha, I would like to turn to you now for some reflecting remarks.
Thank you. I think the next couple of months is certainly going to be challenging for us. We've had a rise in COVID cases. Maybe I think our current number is something close to 8,000, which was a jump of about 4,000 in a month or so, and a month and a half maybe. And we did close our borders in the early parts of the year, but we reopened them in July. I'm not sure what has caused our rise in cases, but we are certainly having to deal with the numbers that have increased and introduction of new measures to deal with those cases. But our Public Health Protection Act enables or empowers the public health authorities to issue the relevant orders to deal with the epidemic. So right now we do have that mechanism in place to cater for any unforeseen developments that may occur. Our Parliament is going into recess in the next week. We are hoping that our COVID special measures bill will be passed in the next week. It's at the reporting stage and will be put to vote next week. So hopefully that will give or provide temporary relief to a lot of families and individuals that have faced hardship because of the epidemic. And in the next month, the Parliament will be in recess. So we hope that we wouldn't have to resort to extraordinary measures to recall the Parliament during the epidemic in the next month or so. Just to acknowledge what Honorable Mohammed Rashid said, I was actually at the Parliament, working at the Parliament at the time the new Parliament building was opened. And I was there when the then Prime Minister visited us for the inauguration. We thank the Parliament or National Assembly of Pakistan for your help in building our Parliament House. Thank you. And thank you for the Max Planck Foundation and the National Dialogue Forum for this opportunity to share our experience with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayesha. And it's great to hear that although there's a lot of challenges ahead of us, to hear the experience of the Maldives, another South Asian nation, which has also got a quite polarized politics. So it's great to have these different experiences here today. I'll just say a quick thank you before handing the floor to Madam Pervaiz for concluding remarks. I'd like to reiterate the thanks that we just had. A huge thank you again to the Seidel Foundation, to the National Dialogue Forum, for organizing the event today. And a huge thank you to our panelists, to Mr. David Wilson, to Bryn Guthrie, and to Ayesha Naim. Thank you all incredibly for your time. I know we've overrun, that's my apologies, but your contributions are incredibly invaluable to share, and it's great to have this kind of discussion in Pakistan. I'd also like to thank everyone who's attended today, and those of us who've already had to leave but are still here. Your interventions are incredibly important, and it's great to continue this dialogue as the challenges continue in the months ahead of us. So with that said, I'd like to hand the floor to Madam Pervaiz for the concluding remarks. Thank you.
First of all, I would like to thank you all for this great experience I've had today. But you know, the greatest lesson this COVID-19 that is emergence of COVID-19 is that Parliament must immediately adopt rules and ensure that the institutions like parliaments can run. But you know, I feel that tackling them will require definitely new ideas, but a very important, more robust political will to have these things in place. And technology needs to be placed, digital access needs to be made available, and we need to move forward together by sharing and learning from each other. And I hope we next time, with all the positive, the challenges this COVID-19 has brought, but there are a lot of opportunities, and we should have more such interactive sessions and learn from each other and share our best practices and what we have achieved and gained out of this COVID-19 situation. I once again thank you all for making me a part of this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shukriya, and I wish you all a good day.